Hi
Everyone.
everyone. Hello everybody. 24 people, 37, big jump. Fantastic. Oh, you're coming in fast now. That's brilliant. 50 people, 60 people. It's my kind of counting. I can count in tens. 86. Wow. 86. Excellent. So let's see in the chat. Is the chat working? Can you talk to us? You can.
She's already, Sonia's already got ahead of you, Cal.
Oh, look, she's had
Excellent.
pie
Derbyshire
too.
Dales and she's had a pie.
Come on then, where
Hi,
is everybody
Sonia.
else from?
Love it.
Excellent. Oh, hello, people from Leeds. Hello. Oh, Nottingham fajitas.
I just love it.
Manchester, Croydon.
We don't charge by the letter. We don't charge by the letter. It's okay. Worcester, Torquay, stir fry. It's like some code, isn't it? Excellent. Oh, hello, lovelies. Hi, Jodie. West Midlands. Hi, everybody. Let's have a look. 159 people. Thank you. If this is your first one, you're more than welcome. Or if you've been to all of them, that's fantastic as well. So I'm going to pass on to Siobhan. We're going to get started on the webinar, and let's get going. Thanks, Siobhan.
Okay, so I've just seen a quick question in the Q&A box and that totally distracted me then. Sorry about that, but I'll have a look at that later and try and give you a reply. So tonight is slightly different. It's really good, actually. I'm almost going to get a night off. I'm going to join you in the chat. I'm going to experience a webinar from a different angle. So we'll be very different tonight, I think. So just to say to you, if you have any tech questions, you know, the usual things about if sometimes people can't hear or can't see, just pop those questions in the Q&A box and Omar and Kat and Chris will deal with those. Any questions that you have for our fabulous guest speaker tonight, Mark, put those into the Q&A box too. And at the end of tonight's session, we are hoping to do as we did a couple of weeks ago and invite those of you who want to switch your cameras on and maybe hold up your object to your camera screen if you've got it with you, or just to say hi and give us a wave if you want to at the end. So we're hoping that we're going to do that again. You'll just need to put your hand up at the end, but we'll tell you about that then. So as I said to you, it's it's almost my night off really. I'm still visiting my daughter in Belfast, so I'm still sitting in an unusual place for me. But tonight I am absolutely delighted that Mark Dole is going to be delivering the main part of the webinar. I'm actually going to step into the spotlight tonight. So I'm going to be the practitioner spotlight and Mark is going to deliver the content of the webinar. And I'm totally delighted that Mark is joining us. Very early in my practice educator career, I read lots of Mark's books and I really looked up to Mark and completely admired his work and you know, kind of idolized him a little bit, if I'm honest. And sometimes when you really like somebody's writing, it's a bit of a letdown when you meet them in the real world. But actually, it's never a letdown with Mark. I've heard Mark speak many times and I'm never let down by it. But I had a particular experience where I applied for a job. Doesn't really matter what the job was, but it was very early when I was training. I applied for this role. And I turned up for the interview with a presentation all ready to go because you had to have a presentation for the interview. I walked into the room and who was interviewing me but Mark Dole? And I fell to pieces because I thought I can't possibly do a presentation in front of this man. I just completely fell to pieces. And I remember very vividly that of all the interviewers, Mark got up, left the room, bought me in a glass of water, said don't worry. He was so kind to me, and to me that was what I would describe as professional kindness. And professional kindness is really important, that we are kind to one another as social workers. And it's always reminded me of the Maya Angelou quote that people will forget what you said and people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And I've never forgotten that moment, that interview where I fell to pieces. And I know that tonight, Mark will make you feel fabulous about being involved in social work, because that's what Mark is always able to do. And I was reflecting on this as we were getting ready to come into the webinar and thinking, I've heard this presentation lots of times, but usually in a big conference room surrounded by lots of people. And I think tonight it's going to be more intimate because we're all listening to this sitting in our bedrooms or in the car for that person who's in the car. And I think it's going to be a very different experience tonight, but I am delighted that Mark has agreed to come along and share social work in 42 objects and more. So it's over to you, Mark, for the night. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Siobhan. I've never had such a nice welcome. If I wasn't already very red, you'd be able to see that I'm blushing. Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me. As you say, it's a newish, well, certainly for me, a very newish experience, and it's a strange intimacy as well, and strange to be talking at my screen, but knowing that you and all our friends and colleagues are out there as well. And I'm really, really looking forward to it. Let me just get used to the technology. I'm going to change the screen. There we go. Back again. I've had a mission for many a year and many a decade now, I suppose, actually, to try to see if the wider world can get a better understanding of social work. I have memories, you mentioned your memories there, Siobhan, and I'm sure all of us listening were thinking of our own memories of being in rooms, of moments of embarrassment and moments of kindness. And I remember in my early years when I was a student, going to parties and being asked what I was doing and say, oh, I'm studying to be a social worker, and then kind of stepping back mentally, as it were, waiting for a kind of response. The best response, obviously, were the pleasant ones, but the most difficult one, I occasionally got some unpleasant responses, but very occasionally. But the most difficult ones were from people who had really no idea what it was and said, oh, what's that? And then I just knew I could sort of see the chasm opening in front of me. I was either going to say something really trite, or I was going to bore them stiff for an hour and a half with a little lecture on what social work was. And indeed, I could, I suppose, have read them out the statement, which I'm sure all your students are familiar with, from the IFSW and the IASSW. This is what, by definition, social work is. I'm not going to read it out, but you can just get the gist by looking at the length of the words. That at the parties where I was asked what I was doing, if I'd sort of said anything like that, I can imagine people would be looking over my shoulder and wanting to go to someone more interesting. And I've sort of thought long over the years, both through my practice as a social worker. I've been a social worker knocking on doors for a good 2 decades, and then I moved into teaching and research. And over that time, I've been sort of thinking about how we can better explain ourselves, I suppose, to the wider world. And then the opportunity came along to think about something entirely different through the new media, to get a website and ask people to submit what social work meant through them via an object. I have to say I had no idea whether this would work or not, but as I'll go on to explain, it was very successful, and I'm hoping that it has given us a collection of stories that help us to show the world what social work is in all its complexity. I want to take a step back first before introducing you to 8 of those stories that are already there on the website, to look at the notion of an object. I think if we sort of use that word object, we often tend to think of something rather neutral, have that word objective, don't we, where we stand back from the situation, and not human, I suppose. But one thing that I've been thinking about more is how actually, objects can be very, very emotive. I present there 2 objects, and one of them in life here. This is my teddy, as old as me, so, you know, quite a few decades on him. And he obviously evokes sort of feelings for me, and he might evoke feelings for you. He's not your teddy, but I guess a lot of people can relate either to the notion to your own teddy bears, or something that you've had since you were young, or just the notion that things that are with us for a long time get special meanings, that we feel attachments to them. And about this time, I also came across a book by Sherry Turkle called Evocative Objects, Things We Think With. And it really helped me think about how objects are linked to our feelings, and that good social work is social work that's in touch with its feelings. She writes, we think with the objects that we love, and we love the objects we think with. Objects are companions to our emotional lives, a provocation to thought. And that most objects exert their holding power because of the particular moment and circumstance in which they come into our lives, and hence the teddy bear. So objects are not cold, dispassionate things. They help, they're often things that we can become attached to and that help with transitions, life transitions, as D.W. Winnicott, the famous child psychiatrist, psychologist, alerted us to. Another strand here, this is a very old-fashioned file. This, when I started as a social worker in Sheffield Social Services in 1976, these were the things that we had to use, basically. They hung up on Rotodecks things. It was all very low-tech. And I remember this moment as though it was yesterday. It must have been the late 70s. I'd not been practicing very long. I was in my late 20s. And a young woman came in. I was doing duty. We used to do duty once every week or so. And a young woman came in, and she was about my age, actually. She was quite heavily pregnant. And she said that her pregnancy was making her think not just to the future and her own child to be, but to her own past, and that she'd been in care in Sheffield. And she realised how very little she really knew about herself and her past. And could I help? Could we help? She figured we'd probably have some records. Anyway, I went to the back and looked on this Rotodecks, and that's not the actual one, but that's a mock-up of this file, which was just, oh, it made me feel awful. It was bulging. I opened it out. It was unkempt, unlooked after. There were photographs of her as a child at various stages. There were drawings that she'd done, mixed amongst psychiatrist reports and social workers reports, and professionalized kind of language, and all sorts of mixed up things. And I felt it really would be disrespectful just to come out from the back office and pop this on the desk. So I went out and I said, and I told her what I'd found, and I said, would she be okay to come back in a couple of days? And I'll go through the file. She wanted to know where she was when. I'll do a chronology, but also there are things in that file that really belonged to her, that she should have photos and drawings. She came back and we did exactly that. And that was such a seminal moment for me, the responsibility that we have in social work for looking at, not just for looking after people, but for helping them to document their lives, really, and to get that sort of sense of identity that comes from having things and knowing things about yourself over the years. So I want to think about objects and identity, and this is a quote from Harriet Ward, who by some real strange coincidence was also a social worker back in 1976, in the late 70s, with my team in Sheffield, but that's another story. So she writes, with such frequent changes of environment, material possessions may become particularly important, as they have the potential to offer one of the few points of consistency in lives that are characterized by transience. So basically, objects are not just things that evoke feelings, they're actually often things that can help us with our sense of identity, and the continuity of the ownership of things can help our sense of identity and who we are. In terms of professional identity, I just wanted to share this with you, and I've got the original here. This I'm going back again. This is the 1970s when I first arrived at Sheffield Family Community Services. This was plonked on my desk. It wasn't even new then. It's got somebody else's name, Fran Powell, in it. Anyway, I've still got it. It's of course completely now defunct by SatNav and the rest of it. But this is a City of Sheffield official street map that workers, local authority workers, got to help them find their way around Sheffield. And although we worked in communities, small communities, which was really good, patch-based work, so obviously I got to know that really well, there were times obviously when I had to go all over the city for one reason or another, and this was really, really important to getting around. So it has a lot of professional history for me, And it also, in a sense, it's a metaphor really for the fact that we often find ourselves working very holistically within the community from A to, it's not actually an A to Z, but from A to Z. And that knowing the people we work with in their families and their communities is really an important part of social work for me. It's not just an individual one-to-one thing. So, put all that together, what objects can mean personally and professionally. And then by sheer happenstance, as this project was just kind of coming to shape, I went to Hull I don't know whether there's anybody here who is from Hull, but that's where I did my training. And I went back and went to the William Wilberforce house. And William Wilberforce, you probably know, was the parliamentarian who finally passed the act back at the beginning of the 19th century that abolished the slave trade and slavery. And of course, there are others, such as the ex-slave Olaudah Equiano, who wrote an amazingly powerful best-selling autobiography in 1789, which helped alert people to the horrors of slavery. There's William Wilberforce, the parliamentarian, but I came across this in the museum in Hull, and it's a chest of objects. And I'd never heard of Thomas Clarkson, but apparently he went around the country in the late 18th century campaigning against slavery and the slave trade. And he took with him a lot of artifacts. He took, it's part of a trade, so he took some of the spices and things that were part of that trade. He took the appalling instruments of slavery, the things that actually enslaved people, the branding irons and the chains. And he also took the beautiful artifacts that the West Africans who were being enslaved made as part of their culture. And he touched the lives of all the people that he spoke to at those meetings up and down the country. And they were touched by, and literally touched, these objects that made the whole notion of slavery much more real to them. And obviously in a totally different context, it made me think even more about the power really of this sense of touch, of things that are tangible, and that maybe we've rather neglected it in social work. So, in terms of the theory, Jean Baudrillard, a French philosopher, wrote a book called The System of Objects. And he helps us understand that it's the relationship of the object, both to other objects and to the human world, that gives its meaning. So if we see an object without some understanding of its context, we can put our own context into it, but we need the story really behind the object. It's not just the object itself. It's the system of things that makes us who we are, and a single object has limited meaningfulness. So, could we develop social work's chest of objects? In the face of what I think is general public ignorance of what we do, could a chest of objects enhance the relationship between the public and our profession? Indeed, might we all enhance our relationship with social work by telling and listening to stories of social work through objects? And if so, what might such a collection of objects look like? So this is when I and some very kind colleagues with more tech skills than I've got developed a website called socialworkin40objects.com. It's still there, and we'll do a plug for it at the end because still collecting objects and stories. And to date, there are over 150 people or objects from people from 26 countries around the world, and there they are, who've donated objects. So I think it shows how cross-cultural the whole notion is as well. What is an object? Well, I entered into this project rather naively, really, because I kind of, I guess, thought of an object as something like that. It's a Chinese bowl, actually. It's one of the objects on the site, donated by a Malay Chinaman who works and lives in Scotland. And he proposed it because it reflects for him, it's been in his family, I should say, for many generations, and it reflects for him the sort of sense of his culture, but also sometimes the sense of being, he uses this word, alien in British society, and how that gives him strength, particularly when he's working with other people who have a feeling of alienness in our society. He also jokes, I don't know whether you can sort of see it, but there's a kind of there's a bit of a crack there, and he says it's broken and it's been put back together, and that somehow reflects his relationship with social work too. I think we can all relate to that. So I thought of an object as something you can kind of hold, that would be solid, and I guess you could go into a museum and see it. But actually, it was quite interesting, quite early on in the project, a whole range of things that really challenged that notion of what an object is came to being. Trees, for example, songs, sort of oral things then. A service user in Scotland proposed a real life library, not an actual library, but a library of real life experiences from service users. Teflon, Mind the Gap in the London Underground. Eyes, Bella the dog, who we will return to very shortly. The panopticon, the all-seeing panopticon, a point from where you can see everything that's going on. And Escher's Enigma. So I personally, as the curator, as it were, and the holder of the website, thought, oh, this is fascinating, because these are things that, had I been getting 40 objects together, I would never have thought of any of these, never mind the stories behind them. So I think the comprehensive open nature of it, just the invitation for people to come and say what they wish, was really illuminating for me and for the people who joined in. So at this point, I want to introduce you to 8 of the people who proposed an object, briefly here to hear their stories and why they proposed their objects, and to tease out some themes from their stories. And at this point, I should really ask Kat, are there any pressing questions at this point, or shall I carry on?
No, nothing at the moment. I think.
Oh, sorry, I've not got my hearing. Sorry, say it again.
Nothing at the moment. I think everybody's mesmerised listening to you.
Okay, I'll carry on, thanks.
All right.
If I wear these earphones when I'm talking, it all sounds very strange, so that's why I've taken them out. Okay, so story number 1, object number 1, comes from Mokaitia Mangana. She's a student in South Africa. I should say I asked people when they submitted an object to the site, they send it to me first and then we'd have a discussion. And I'd ask them to say a few things about themselves, not a CV, but something about, what their relationship is to social work, why they're interested in social work. They may be social workers, but we've got objects from people who are not social workers, but have an interest in it. So Mokaitia said, I chose social work because it changes lives and helps people to stand on their own feet after the social worker leaves. It changes mindsets and empowers people. We aren't all-knowing experts. We start where the client is. In the end, you just have to have a love for people and a belief that they can change their own lives. And obviously people use the terminology that they use in their own part of the world. And Mokaitia proposed a car jack and a lug wrench. And she said, I can't quite see it on my screen because I've got pictures, so let me just read it out. She said, like a car jack, social work helps lift people out of their current situations to make a positive change. Like a lug wrench, social work helps loosen clients so they can express thoughts, struggles, feelings. We help tighten clients to be strong enough to face their problems and work on them. And for me, Mokaitia's story, I think that stories mean different things to different people. Clearly it means what she says, but I also thought to myself that this is a delightfully utopian vision of social work. It's about, actually for me, that balance between the idealism and the realism that we need in our practice. And it speaks to hope and belief in what good social work practice can be. And I put there this quote I think it's from BSTEC actually, and it's basically how to be a clear-eyed idealist and a firm-footed realist. And I think that's one of the real challenges in social work practice, to keep on to that idealism year after year, throughout everything, why you came into social work and why you want to stay with it, but also to be pragmatic and realistic enough to be able to keep your feet on the ground and to recognize sometimes the difficulties of making changes as well. So person number 2 is Barbara Friesen. She's at the other part of the world from South Africa. She's at the other age of the spectrum, and she's not a student, she's a very experienced social work researcher. She wrote, "I feel most of social work's energy and attention goes into helping and fixing people, yet this seems inadequate. At graduate school, I met community organisers for the first time. These students were disruptive, interrupting lectures to say people should be engaging in rent and garbage strikes rather than having their thoughts and behaviours treated by caseworkers. These students were very rude, but I thought they were right." And to me, let's have a look at what Barbara suggested. Barbara suggested a sticking plaster, or I think in America they call them Band-Aids. I feel that much of social work goes to mending and fixing individuals with Band-Aids. This often falls short of the real need for social reform. It's trying to move a mountain with a spoon. I'd like more emphasis on community organising, policy change, and action to promote social justice. And for me, this is the other side of the coin from utopianism, a kind of dystopianism, looking at how the limits of social work, I guess, looking at social work through a social justice prism. How can everything that we do be related to and promote social justice? And Barbara is realistically looking at some of the difficulties that we face as social workers. So again, how to be a clear-eyed idealist and a firm-footed realist. 2 fairly basic objects, but they open up really fundamental issues in social work and the contested nature of our profession in a kind of really, I feel, accessible way rather than, very heavy text. This is Ben Rakes. He's a social worker in the United Kingdom. He says, "I learned a great deal from the people I supervised as a probation officer, their resilience in the face of tremendous adversity. I've always believed that relationships can be transformative and that the best relationships are reciprocal." And Ben chose these elephants in the room, obviously stuffed animals, stuffed elephants. And he writes, "In every social work setting I've ever worked in, there's always been an elephant in the corner, something obvious, but that no one wants to talk about. A colleague who'd never heard the phrase before gave me these actual stuffed elephants. I have them in my office as a reminder, always to name the elephant in the corner." So a physical memento reminder of the significance, I think, of knowing how to ask difficult questions and thinking about the relationships, our relationship to the people with whom we work and the degree to which these should be and can be mutual. So I think Ben's talking about how do we challenge the status quo? How is our relationship and how should our relationship be central to our social work practice? This is Joan Corsten. She is a former service user. She's from the United Kingdom. Her longer story is on the website if you want to follow this up. It's a very moving story indeed. She writes that she first encountered social services when I was 5. Some ladies came to our house and took me, my 3-year-old sister, and my 1-year-old brother away from my mother, out of our house, down the street lined with curious neighbours, and into 2 waiting cars. I never saw my mother again. So Joan was in care, as you can see. She's now a 70-year-old woman. I know Joan, and when the project opened, I asked her, would she mind, would she think about her time as a social work service user, a client as she was called then, a resident in a children's home in those early years and teen years as well? And was there something that she could choose that could represent, in a sense, or that she reflect on? And she said she would think about it. She came back and she said actually she was still in touch with one of the other girls, now older women, who had been with her all that time in the children's home in Yorkshire. And she mentioned this project to her friend, and instantly they had both said the same object, if you forgive the notion of a dog being an object. They both said instantly, Bella the dog. Now, as I said earlier, the notion of object can be very challenging because not only was Bella a live creature, but also, of course, she's now been dead many, many a year. But Joan's story is so powerful that Bella the dog still remains with her. Joan writes, all of us children in the home loved Bella, and Bella loved all of us, always, indiscriminately and lavishly. She was a wonderful dog, placid and gentle and endlessly affectionate. So, beautiful Bella, you were unconditional love and acceptance, a wonderful contrast to the emotional austerity of life in a children's home in the 1950s. And Joan is not saying that she suffered any abuse, far from it, she didn't, but she talks about the emotional austerity of being cared for by people who don't give you the conditional love. They look after you, but they don't have that unconditional love that Bella the dog was able to give. Lots and lots of course, things to think about here. In modern parlance, I guess we talk about service user empowerment. What is our relationship with the people that we work with? We talk about experts by experience. How do we really live that in our professional lived experience? How do we make sure that that service users are really there seen as experts through their own experience? And how do we face that with honesty and integrity? And also, I've been around a bit now, how do we learn from our past, not just our personal past, but our professional past? How do we learn the lessons of poor practice, past and indeed present? So this is Duduzile Sokile, and Dudu is a social worker and community activist in South Africa. And she writes, I've served my people working in non-profit organizations in South Africa. I was inspired by my mother's altruistic causes in the community I grew up in. And Dudu proposed food. She writes, throughout my social work career, I've worked with people living in abject poverty, and the direst need is a basic commodity, food. I decided to own my country's poverty and do something about it. Indeed, social work is about owning the community's problems and doing something about them. Now that's very controversial in a Western, certainly United Kingdom context. I can imagine many a practice educator saying to a student who said, I want to own my community's problems and do something about them, saying, could be very careful about overcommitment here and over-identification. So I think it's a fascinating object. It's actually a photograph from South Africa, but sadly we've got a food bank just up the way here in Sheffield too. You probably have in all your districts. This is the United Kingdom in 2020. And I guess it's a stark reminder that for many of the people we work with, even the basic commodities like food come first. So we talked about service user empowerment. Well, what about community empowerment? What role do social workers have and how do we engage with the communities that we work with? And this whole notion of engagement, how close and how distant, both geographically but emotionally, are we with the people we work with? And how has that changed over the years? I shock my students sometimes by telling stories of life in the 1970s as a social worker in Sheffield, every Tuesday lunchtime, going out to the pub, having a curry, smoking some cigarettes, having a couple of beers, getting in the car, driving off to see a service user, maybe having a polo mint or something to master breath, not because, you know, it was wrong to have a drink, but because he didn't want to be breathing fumes over people. And doing a social work, well, I mean, probably I've broken 3 or 4 laws and I'd be dismissed from practice now. Back in 1976, we all thought we were doing a rather good job. So I'd like to ask you now, in 2020, if you go forward in 40 years from now, what will the social work students in 2060 be looking back at now and saying, oh my God, can you imagine what they did that? Because I promise you, we really didn't think we were doing anything untoward back in 1976. Okay, so engagement, how does it change with time? And how do you plot your own course of engagement with the people that you work with? This is Enekele Sayan David. He's a newly qualified social worker from Nigeria. He writes, I grew up in a small village in Nigeria. Social service is not a new phenomenon in Nigeria. The traditional rulers provide social welfare services through the elders and family heads. The kinship system provides for child and family welfare, mental health, and care for older people. And David chose Ileke Ibile, which is the Yoruba word for traditional beads. And he writes that as a young boy, excuse me, as a young boy, I loved the traditional beads worn by the village leaders. The leaders meet the social needs of the villagers and they deal with problematic behaviours and they find solutions. I see social workers as wearing the traditional beads. It can't be physically observed, but the social work profession is the traditional bead. Now, this resonated with me at so many different levels. First of all, the whole notion of professional authority. Where does it arise? We've read all the texts about personal authority, you know, legitimacy, the law, our organizational authority and the rest of it. But where do we, from whom do we and where do we derive our legitimacy? And there's David in Nigeria drawing these amazing parallels between how he sees social work profession and how he sees the leadership in tribal villages. So there's a whole notion of authority and legitimacy and leadership in social work. Are we seen as leaders in our communities? And for me also, this whole notion of the local and the global in social work, which teases us a lot. Can we talk about the social work that I talk about here in Sheffield, in Yorkshire, in the UK in 2020? How does that relate to the social work in 2020 in Nigeria, or the social work in Sheffield in 1976, or indeed the social work in the original settlements in the 19th century? How do we bring that all together? And I think so powerfully in so few words and with one object, David really does that for me. And he helps me actually make the connections that I want to make between social work in a more proceduralized setting like the UK and social work in a place like Nigeria. This is Beyant Singh Suvali. He's a social worker in the United Kingdom. He writes, I'm a social worker and a percussionist, and I'm at my happiest when combining the two. I was born and bred in Nottingham, where my family was exposed to complex issues of race, poverty, and disability. I grew up steeped in traditions of Indian music. And Beyant chose, not unsurprisingly, the drum. And he writes, through drums, I facilitate a process where social justice, music, performance, and the well-being of people intermingle. The drum has come with me every step of the way. I've drummed my way into the heart of social work practice. It's allowed me to retain a creative practice in the teeth of the harsh realities of austerity and bureaucracy. So here's a guy who's been doing social work some time, and he's managed for me to integrate his personal biography and his professional practice. Now, I completely understand that for many people, it's quite right to feel a separation between those two. Why should they come together? For me, and particularly for Beyant, I think to be able to integrate in some way your personal biography, who you are, maybe what you're good at with your professional practice, gives it some edge and perhaps helps sustain you through the bureaucracy, the austerity, and the procedural nature of social work. So what is it that social works actually do? And how can they do it creatively? How do we share the tools of our trade? and how do we share these creative practices? And last of these 8, but not least, let me introduce you to Sheila Slessor. She's a social work lecturer in the United Kingdom. She writes, managing childcare and protection issues as a social worker and balancing this with my own parenting was always complicated, invariably involving guilt, mum space in my head being used to think about childcare cases when I was at home being a mum. And she writes, she proposed this model of Postman Pat, who for people not in the UK, I've had to explain, was a BBC television character. And this model of Postman Pat was made by her son when he was 5 years old, about a quarter of a century ago. Patrick is her pet name for him, came to work with me then, and he's been a permanent feature on my social work desk for about 30 years. He's a constant reminder that though social work can never be a 9-to-5 job, my own boys always had a priority. And this is so much to home. It's on her desk. She's moved jobs. She's taken it from desk to desk. It's something one of her boys made himself all those years ago, and it's still there. So it's very much to me about the private and the public. How and where do we draw those boundaries? It's about self-care and how we avoid burnout. And I put money on the fact that Patrick has helped Sheila avoid burnout more than a dozen, 3 dozen bullet points in some organizational policy telling people how they can avoid burnout. Just glancing at Patrick from time to time during a working day must be very, very powerful indeed. It was certainly powerful to me. I had the chance of going up. She's in Aberdeen. I was an external examiner there. And I went there, and I'd been before, and I'd obviously passed Patrick by many times and not seen him. But now he was famous, I wanted to see him and to hold him. He's quite small, actually, a little tacky, which Sheila would admit to. He's been broken and mended, etc. But somehow became a very special object, a charged object, which I'll talk about in just a few minutes. So, a pause here. We just had 8 objects: the car jack and the lug wrench, the sticking plaster, the elephants in the room, Bella the dog, food, the traditional beads, a drum, and Postman Pat. And I reckon we've had more about the heart of social work, as it were, than I could get in 3 books, really. And I could talk to someone next door who has nothing to do with social work, never had a social worker, doesn't know what it's about, and tell them these stories. And wow, I think they would know what we were doing, and they would want to, if not join us, at least support us. And take a pause because we have a surprise, well, not a surprise. We do know that Siobhan is our spotlight person today. And Siobhan, I'm going to put my earphones in so I can hear you. You're going to talk about your object.
I am. I'm hoping people can hear me because I don't normally just step in at this point. So I think Omar's put my mic on for me. Can you hear me okay, Mark?
I can't hear you very well, no.
Okay.
Okay, try again.
Is that working now? Because Omar's changed my spot, I think.
Go ahead again, sorry.
Okay. So Mark knows that Mark's asked me lots of times to propose an object, and over the years I've never managed to do it. I've been one of those procrastinators, like writing an essay when you keep putting it off. I've always kept putting it off because I didn't know what represented social work to me. There were so many different things that social work was. I always wanted to use different objects. But this time, when I invited Mark to come to the webinar, I thought I absolutely have to come up with an object. And it just came to me straight away. I didn't procrastinate in the way I used to. I'd always be, oh, it could be this, it could be that. And this is the object. This is a picnic hamper. And it means lots of different things to me. But I'll start off with some very basics. To me, growing up, I grew up in a very working class family. And a picnic basket like this to me was so upper class. It wasn't even middle class. It was like, just if we went on a picnic, it was a jam sandwich in a carrier bag. So to me, a picnic basket is a class thing. And I actually think there's a lot of issues around class in social work. So that was one issue for me, because I do think there are aspects of class that I think sometimes our history has been about class, and I'm still struggling sometimes with aspects of middle class social work, I think. I also think a picnic in itself is all about variety and diversity. So you have lots of different things in a picnic basket that make up your meal. And actually, to me, social work has always been very diverse. So I've been in social work for 30 years, but in very diverse roles. But I've always found it incredibly satisfying. So it's been different bits, but very satisfying. And a picnic as well, to me, is something that you do with other people. It's not, you don't take a picnic basket out just to have your own lunch. You do a picnic to eat with others, to share with others. And in fact, I always think of a picnic as quite, it shows love to me. When you do a picnic, you go out with family, and to me, it shows love. And I've been really interested listening to your presentation, Mark. And I've read the book. And I know a lot about the project, but I always hear something different. And tonight I've heard the word love twice. And to me, social work is all about love and professional love, but it is all about love. So I think there's an element of that within the picnic basket for me. And also, a picnic basket is woven, isn't it? And you can actually see the weave on this particular basket. So you weave things across, and is it called the weft and the warp or something? It weaves across, so that actually what's happening is we create something quite strong when we work together. And I think it's that strength of working together, the warp and the weft, that creates social work. But this particular picnic basket is really important to me, because this picnic basket was sent to me by the Social Work Student Connect team a few weeks ago. So I was at home a lot during lockdown on my own. For a long time, I was just on my own at home, and I was getting quite low. I was feeling quite down. And I think that the team of students kind of saw that in me, and they put this together. They sent me this with all the ribbons on the top, and there was a little gift inside from each of them with a message, and it was very lovely and really thoughtful. And I'm now keeping it in my office with those little ribbons on. And I think the ribbons, in a way, demonstrate celebrating, I suppose. And to me, I think we should celebrate social work more, and we should celebrate what we do well. And one of the things that I think has been amazing for me is going into this lockdown, doing these webinars with this fabulous group of students. And so to me, this particular picnic basket really matters. And it's in my office now. It's got all of those ribbons still on it. I've got all the messages are going to be, I'll be getting those messages out and reading them forever every time I get a little bit low. And they called it the pamper hamper. So it also, I think, links into that need for self-care as a social worker. But I suppose the main thing, and the thing I'm going to end the story about this particular picnic basket on, is it's all about, to me, the future of social work. And, you know, when you ask that question about, you know, what are we going to be thinking in 20 or 30 years time about social work? And this group of students are going to be the future of social work. They're going to be those social workers in 20 or 30 years time. And I am so confident in what they are going to do. And the audience, and just listening to the chat tonight and listening to what people are saying about social work, listening to the stories, I think we, you know, the future looks very bright, if you like. And you normally only go out and have a picnic on a bright sunny day, and I think the future definitely looks bright for us in social work. So that's the story of my object, which I've taken forever to get to working out what object I'm going to share, but there's the story of my object.
Siobhan, that is a wonderful story. It is, I mean, it just covers all aspects, the personal and the professional, and we can all, I certainly can all relate to the thematic elements, the class, the diversity, the pampering, the looking after, and an object that will last for, you know, rest of your years, and you'll be able to keep all sorts of things in it as well as take it out for picnics, and it will have those memories, and now it will have those additional memories of the presentation in this webinar. So it tells its own story as well. And my only regret is that you didn't do this a lot earlier, but I suppose you didn't get the hamper till now, so that's okay. This is a lovely slide to enter into the next one, actually, Siobhan. You couldn't have done better, which is the whole notion of charged objects. And I only came across this because I wanted to write a more academic article based on all this. I suppose in my own mind I had this notion of putting this whole project in its Sunday best, because I wanted, as well as speaking to the broader public, as I've mentioned, I wanted our project to speak to the people who read the journals and the rest of it as well. And so I did quite a lot of research into material culture theory, and I came across this whole notion of charged objects. And there's a little story here that's told in material culture theory about an anonymous fragment of pot found in an archaeological dig. To you, I mean, I can't even really see where it is there, but to you and me, it looks like broken crock or even just a bit of something. But the experts, they retrieve it, they clean it, they polish it, they identify it, they categorize it, and whoa, it transitions to a respected museum where it's carefully reconstructed as a bowl from an ancient civilization. It's placed in a perspex case. People form long queues to feast their eyes upon it. So from a piece of old crock, it's been transformed into a revered artifact. It's become what's known in that particular theory as a charged object. And I mentioned earlier about Postman Pat, for me, had become a charged object because he wasn't just a model made 30 years ago. He had this whole story around him. Your hamper, which I'm dying to see when we're allowed to actually go out and touch things, is now also a charged object and will be a charged object. When we get this Museum of Social Work, the actual exhibition of social work, Siobhan, you will have to put it on loan for the exhibition. I hope that's okay. And I want to end this story bit really, because we're coming up towards time, with a final story from Simon Covain, who's a social work lecturer in the UK. And he proposed this mouthpiece. He writes, "This mouthpiece is a never to be forgotten reminder of my father, a talented musician who I only got to know in the last months of his life. 13 weeks after I first met him, he died." I should explain that Simon's father left, or his mother certainly divorced from his father in his early years. It was a very difficult situation. He never knew his father, but as an adult, well into his adulthood actually, he decided that he wanted to find out who wanted to meet his father. He did, and just a mere 13 weeks after meeting him, his father died. And that very day, his father's house was burgled. In the evening, his body was removed. And this mouthpiece to his French horn was the only possession of note left behind. So all those years of loss and not there with his father, I mean, it hadn't troubled him immensely. It's just one of those curiosities. But having found his father and found out about how good a musician he was, all that was left behind in all the kind of mess from the burglary was this mouthpiece. And he spins a tale, like you did so eloquently, Siobhan, about the mouthpiece, not just as a personal object, but as a professional one too. It reminds him that he knew nothing about his adoption by his adoptive father when he was a little boy or baby, but somewhere in his life, a social worker, an unsung social worker, did such important work behind the scenes to help secure his future. And he also, of course, he uses the mouthpiece as a metaphor for helping social work, in a sense, giving voice to people who are finding it difficult to give their own voice. A very charged object, so I'll just go back. And when we had the law, there's a book, and I must tell you about this because I am greatly indebted to Siobhan. Siobhan came out of the blue at a point when I thought, I'd like to put these objects into a book and to show the world the stories from all these people. And I wanted the book to be well, you always want your books to be ethically produced, but no profits involved, because these were stories freely given by people who visited the website. And Siobhan knows a printer who pays proper rates, you know, the workforce are unionized, and got the printer to print this book. Siobhan took no profit from it at all. There is a little profit, but that profit goes to a children's centre that I know in Delhi, in India. And we've raised something like £1,200 from the book to date. It's a great book, but also you can feel you're buying something that's been ethically produced and that is going to a very good cause as well. Simon's in here, and all of the objects to the point at which I published the book, we published the book, 127 objects are all in there with photographs and the brief stories as well. So I'm going to conclude just by saying that, having gone through those 127 objects at the time, I noticed some patterns, that there are different kinds of objects. There are objects that are and I should say that one object can fall into more than one category, of course, but there are objects that are clearly metaphors, like the car jack, like the band-aid, like the elephants in the room. They're objects that illustrate social work via parallels with that object. This came later in my thinking, but there are metaphysical objects that actually illuminate social work, but don't exist as such in the real material world. They're more like ideas almost, or like Bella the dog, who did exist but some time ago. There are socio-political objects that link social work to our social and political context. Sticking plaster does that as well as being metaphorical, and food. There are historical objects that illuminate our past. There are very practical objects. I mean, I guess if this was a seminar with webinar with medical students, we'd all have stethoscopes and, you know, things that are very used in medicine. If we were studying the law, we might have the scales of justice. There's no single object that you put on a sign saying social work ahead. We don't use a lot of practical objects in our work, but we use some. And we saw that example from Beant of the drum, of a practical object used in his work. And then there are these personal objects that link our own history and biography to our personal association with the social work profession. And it's the objects that can do that, as well as some of these other things that Siobhan so wonderfully illustrated just now. It's these personal objects that I think have the biggest potential to be the charged objects by which we can tell the story of our profession. So in conclusion, I think an inclusive approach to collecting objects can provide a diverse collection. It can give a comprehensive display of social work, and indeed one that illustrates the notion of social work as this contested profession where we have many different views of what it is. An object's unlikely to speak for itself, and the donor's explanation is needed, I think. And I've kind of likened this to when you go to a museum or an exhibition, the plaque at the side that gives you kind of context. I don't know whether you like to see the object first and read the plaque, or read the plaque first and see the object, but the two really are symbiotic. The plaque, the information as it were, the story, helps to contextualize the object. And as I've just said, the more strongly the object links the story of the person to the narrative of the profession, I think the more charged that object becomes. So a virtual exhibition of social work is possible via a wide collection of objects, and it does provide the potential for a better dialogue between social work and the wider public. Some questions. Could we go even further? Could the social work curriculum be constructed around objects? Now that would be interesting, wouldn't it? Could an object-based curriculum help to integrate the class-based learning with the practice-based learning better? A common language. And talking of a common language, since an object-based curriculum transcends language, the stories don't, I admit, but the object does. Could it overcome national and linguistic barriers to internationalize the social work curriculum as well? So some ambitious questions there, but I'd like to see it happening. There's the children, the boys at Tara in Delhi. The website's still open. If you've been inspired, I've already had 3 emails before the webinar began with people with objects, which is wonderful. if you're inspired to propose your own object, do contact me at that email address. And do indeed, of course, think about purchasing the book as well. You can do that through Siobhan and the website. On this PowerPoint, which Siobhan's going to make available, and the handout too, there's also a reasonably extensive reading list if you want to continue this in more detail. And I thank you for listening, and I'm going to be very interested in your reflections, objects and questions. Thank you.
Mark, there is a specific couple of questions. Can you hear me okay?
I can.
Okay, so there's one of the questions that I think you'll be able to answer quite easily. It says, how many people have been part of this project? But it says how many individuals, service users have been part of the project?
Well, 150 something people have been part of the project directly. But, and I've not counted specifically the number of service users, but a number of service users. And indeed, there was a service user group. Well, there's been a couple of service user groups actually got involved, one of whom was a service user group of women with learning disabilities who, together with their social worker, constructed an object to propose to the website. So the project actually helped them to think about making an object. They made 40 pieces of jewellery, actually. So I can't say exactly how many service users, but service users have been involved. And actually, I've presented this now at over 30 different conferences and seminars and workshops. So if you think of the people who are involved in that sense, who've heard it and other people who've bought the book and read about it, it must be thousands, I imagine, by now. But in terms of actual contributions of objects, it's just over 150.
Okay, and then we've got quite a few questions, but I'm just going to ask you one more because of the time.
Yes.
But, I think it's a very ambitious question. It goes with your ambitious questions, I think. So it says, and it might be more metaphorical and just to add to your ambitious questions, but it says, is it possible to build a theory or a model in social work through these objects and pictures?
Wow, that's a big question, and big questions need to be asked. I think it is. And I feel on a personal level, because of the research that I said I did around the theory, around, I visited museum ethnography and material culture theory, as well as obviously social work theory. It's leading me towards that. And I'd love people to get involved and join in, because big theories need lots of people, need collectives. If people are really interested in the theoretical aspect of it, then when you get the handout or the PowerPoint later further down from this slide, the reading list, the article that was published in the British Journal of Social Work is listed there, and they chose it as their free download for that issue. It's April 2019, so you can download the article. I've written it in an accessible way, but I'm not shied away from the theory base, and it goes some way. It doesn't answer that question. It's a huge question and you wouldn't expect it to be answered, but it certainly goes some way to answering it. And the short answer, I think, is yes. I think it would be possible. Yeah.
Good. And everybody in the chat is very excited that you've said yes. It's like the Del Monte man has said yes. That's the advert.
Well, I'm wearing the Del Monte jacket, you know.
They're all very excited. So I don't know. I think, Omar, do we want people to put their hands up now if people want to? I think what we're going to do, Mark, is we're going to have people raising their hand if they want to come on camera at the end and maybe show their object, or even just to say hello and wave. So I think for the moment now, the tech team are going to be, so if I just say, raise your hand if you want your camera switching on and you want to wave and show your object or say hi to Mark. Oh, there we go. There's some objects. So the tech team are now uploading everybody and putting their cameras on. Just let me say to you that an email will come out tomorrow with everything that Mark has said, and it will also have joining instructions for next week's webinar. So Jodie, while you're on, do you want to tell us about your object?
Yes, thank you. I've picked the paperclip with the rainbow. After every rainbow, there's always hope. social workers are renowned for trying to hold everything together, and professionally and personally, I find this really, really useful.
Lovely.
Yeah, thank you.
Nice. Have we got more people coming on camera? Because we've got quite a lot of people raising their hands.
Yeah,
Kat,
going through.
are you doing them? Thank you, Kat. I don't know how to, otherwise I would help you. So we should have more people appearing on camera now.
Great.
Oh yes, I've now got loads of people. Oh, I can see people. I can see Regina. I can see Rachel holding a
I'm going to take a photograph.
flower. We're not going to have time for everyone to talk. You can see them. Yes, take a photograph. It will also go on the YouTube channel. We'll try to make sure that we get everybody on. I can see Sonia's got a toothbrush. That's an interesting one. Is that a doll? Lisa?
Yeah, it's a doll.
It's a doll.
Yes.
Got a spoon, a love spoon, I think that is, actually.
A Welsh love spoon, yeah.
Welsh love spoon.
Love is at the heart of social work.
Absolutely it is. And we've got a webinar on that coming up soon, Helen, so you'll enjoy that one.
Brilliant.
Oh, I like the sunflower. Very nice.
That was great. I can see, what's that pink thing there?
Is that a dumbbell?
Is it a dumbbell? Is it? Is that, I'm going to ask you to unmute. Can you?
Another doll.
Another doll. There's
There we go. Do you want to explain your object? We've unmuted you.
Kikomo.
Yeah.
Have I got your name right? Tell us about your object. We can just see a pink thing. It looks strange. What is it?
It's an exercise.
Yeah.
Oh, it's an exercise like a dumbbell. Exercise.
Like a dumbbell.
Okay. Let's go to the next screen along. Oh, look, we've got another huge screen come up here. So there's a Play-Doh. Oh, Bethany, was it you that put the Play-Doh onto Twitter? Yes, it was Bethany. I thought your explanation of Play-Doh was fabulous. There was also Amanda, Colin the Cactus. Is Amanda here with Colin the Cactus? Because, you know, Mark said the Postman Pat became famous.
Yeah.
Colin,
I'm here, Siobhan. I'm here with Colin and one of his little babies.
Oh.
Tell us about Colin, Amanda. Tell everyone about Colin, because Colin is now famous.
He is now Twitter famous, yeah. Colin has been with me throughout my whole social work career. My son, when he was 5, and he found out that I had a job that had a desk and I needed to have something on my desk. So he brought me a little tiny Colin. He named it Colin. So that's why we have Colin. And Colin has now grown into a huge Colin. And he is very prolific at growing babies, and so I'm forever having to repot babies, and I took the opportunity to give babies and foster them out to the young people that I was working with. So there's lots of little Collins in lots of care leavers, new pads, and also colleagues that have moved on to new jobs and things. They've taken a Colin with them, and I'm sure that there's a few Collins on dusty window shelves in social work offices as well. So yeah,
I love the idea of Colin's babies being spread around social work. Yeah, I think definitely spread the Colin loves, the chat box says.
Oh, definitely.
These objects are fabulous. We're not going to have time to ask everybody to talk about their objects, but you're holding them up and it's I can see there's a telescope there. I can see that there's some fabulous objects. And I'm just going to say to you, send those in, submit them to the website, because the more that's out there, the more that we can explain what we do, the better. I think it's a fabulous project that Mark's doing. He is a wonderful curator of the objects. And the book, I think if those of you who are on placement want to get your practice educator a gift, the book is a beautiful gift to give to anybody in social work, but it's also a gift to social work. So, you know, Mark has We've done it in a way that all of the profits go straight into Tara. Every month they get some money from the book sales, which is brilliant. So thank you ever so much. I think Omar has made sure we've recorded it so that everybody is on screen, because you're all waving with your objects. I love Teresa's got a teddy bear out, so we could end with the teddy bear.
We've got a little one there that's waving at us as well, Siobhan.
Oh, where's that? Is that with Kerry?
Razwana.
Razwana. Oh, Razwana. Oh, is that
her little daughter is waving hello to everybody.
Oh, there we go. Hello,
hello.
Razwana. Hello. It's lovely pigtails. I can see you. I think I saw somebody else's child join us. Was it Kerry's? Kerry, have you got a child wants to wave? They're welcome to come and join us. That's what these Wednesday night webinars are all about, bringing the family
together.
Lovely. And Kelly's put in the chat how to submit your object to Mark's project. Omar, we've got children talking to us now.
Oh, we've got lots of children coming in now.
Children, all the children are coming now.
Family affair.
Real family affair.
All right, you can go.
Omar, can you put in the chat the link to next week's webinar? Is that possible for that to go into the chat? Next week's webinar is number 10. So we're thinking next week we want to do a full share of reflective models. I know that since webinar 2, loads of you have been developing your own reflective models. Now you might develop a reflective model around an object after tonight, or your reflective model could be anything. What we're hoping to do next week is share as many models as you create. So if you create a model, email it through to me, or if you let the social media team know as well. So if you're on Twitter or Instagram, Becky does Instagram and put it onto Twitter. If you submit your reflective model, we're going to have different spotlights next week. So there might be a few spotlights. So if anybody has a model that you have developed, you would like to step into the spotlight, email us, let us know. The follow-up email will come out tomorrow. But Jodie has said that was a lovely finish to a lovely evening, and it absolutely was. And seeing all the children was really delightful. So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you again to Mark, the most professionally kind man in social work. That's where we started, and that's where we're going to end.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you all. Thank you all very much.
Thank
Good
you,
night.
Mark.
Take
Bye,
care.
everyone.
Good night.
Bye.
Good night.
Bye-bye.